Welcome back to Psychedelics, everybody. This is your host, Kyle Bull, along with Joe Moore. In this episode, Joe and I get to chat with Hamilton Souther, the founder of Blue Morpho, which is an ayahuasca retreat center down in the Peruvian Amazon, I believe a little bit outside of Iquitos, Peru. A little bit about Hamilton. Hamilton focuses his work on universal spiritual philosophy. He's bilingual in English and Spanish and has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and has studied shamanism in California, Cusco, and down in the Amazon. Hamilton was given the title Master Shaman by his teachers, Alberto Torres de Villa and Julio Lorena Pinedo. I believe I'm pronouncing those right. So he apprenticed under Alberto and Julio and earned the title Master Shaman. So Hamilton guides ayahuasca ceremonies and leads shamanic workshops down in Peru. This episode was really fun. It was really cool to chat with Hamilton. We get into talking about ayahuasca and how he came to ayahuasca, studying anthropology, leaving the States, being called to go down to Peru and really kind of dive into shamanic training. And that's one thing we focus on in this episode, and I don't think we've touched it too often. What is that calling for shamanism, or to kind of fall into this work? And so we explore with Hamilton his calling for shamanic training, which, he said can be very long and difficult, and it is a calling because you have to commit your whole life to it. And, I have a background in studying shamanism as well, and I did a little bit of studying with a teacher in Vermont who's a little bit of Lakota, Cherokee, some more Native American shamanism. And, this is it's a long kind of training, and something I've chatted with my teachers about is kind of like this calling, right? And traditionally, shamanism, or to step into the role of a medicine person, or to step into training to become a shaman, it's usually, there's a few different ways for it. It's passed down the family lineage. Maybe a family member, mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, was a medicine person at one point and is just kind of in the blood. Another really common traditional type of way to step into this work is an initiation or a calling. Traditionally, there's a term called like a shamanic illness, shamanic sickness, where somebody experiences near death, in a sense. Could be from a near-death experience, falling very ill, sick, and it really kind of brings you closer to that spirit world, in a sense. And as my teacher always said, the spirits kind of pick you and choose you. And this type of work is more of a calling. So it was really interesting to dig into Hamilton's journey in shamanism and exploring shamanic training. I don't think we've talked about it too much on the show before, like kind of what goes into some of this work and how traditionally people step into this role. It's very long. It's very difficult. There's a teacher, a Mayan shaman that I really like, Martin Prachtel. I remember doing a workshop with him a while back, and I really liked his books. And I remember he always said, nobody wants this role. There's a lot of trials and tribulations that come along with it, and a lot of responsibility. And so, I think having an understanding of how people step into this role is really important nowadays, when there's, a lot of people probably calling themselves that. And, people do get called to this work. And, my one teacher always said the spirits kind of just pick you or choose you, right? And so, it doesn't always matter sometimes. Well, I guess this could be argued about lineage. But my teacher always said, the spirits kind of choose you. And it's this calling, So, all right, I'm rambling too much about this shamanic initiation, and we'll let Hamilton describe his experience. And maybe I'll put in the show note, I have a write-up on one of my other blogs at Setting Sun Wellness all about the shamanic illness that I wrote, I believe, during my undergrad. So I'll post that in the show notes. And if you want to learn about what a shamanic illness is or the shamanic sickness and kind of like that initiatory process, you can go over to psychedelicstoday.com, check out Hamilton's episode, and I'll paste that into the links below in the show notes. So you can learn a little bit more about kind of like that initiation process. And I think that's it on this end of talking about the show. I guess a little bit of updates. I just got back from Colorado this morning. I'm recording this Monday morning on May 20th. And Joe and I spent almost 2 weeks together. We hosted a nice breathwork workshop. We had about 12 people up in Breckenridge. Really awesome. Some people went really deep, and it's always an honor to be able to hold space for people with that work. It's always really powerful, and it's always really interesting to see what comes up in the group sessions there. We also hosted a few psychedelic meetups up in Breckenridge, and it was really fun. It was really good to spend time with Joe. We live on kind of opposite sides. I'm here in New Jersey, Joe's out in Colorado. So it was really great to connect with the Colorado community. The trip in itself was so synchronistic. It was really cool to hear about mushrooms becoming decriminalized while I was out there down in Denver. That was really huge news. And it was a really, really awesome trip. And we also launched our first two cohorts, the general cohort of navigating psychedelics and the navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. Got week 1 down already. It's been awesome. We've been having really great conversations about all sorts of things about psychedelics. The intro classes, we went all over the board. So we are looking forward to continuing offering these live courses and building community that way and deepening our learning and conversations around psychedelics. It was really exciting to connect with a lot of therapists that are just interested in getting into this work or wanting to know how to kind of quote unquote come out of the psychedelic closet with colleagues and whatnot. So we had a nice conversation about that because it can be challenging. If you're interested in this field, there's more research coming out, but if you're a therapist and maybe your colleagues aren't always on board with this, and it might feel scary or tricky. So it's always nice to connect with others that are kind of going through the same thing and having similar questions. And that's a little bit of the updates on our end. If you want to support the show, I believe now we have a donate page, psychedelicstoday.com/donate. Multiple ways to donate, from Patreon, Venmo, even Bitcoin. Getting in on the crypto space. If you want to donate some crypto to us, we accept that. And then, if that's not an option, sharing a piece of content. I mean, that's really the biggest way to support the show, by continuing to listening and sharing the content with others. So, maybe finding something on our Instagram and just reposting a photo or a picture, or just sharing the podcast on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, wherever, if that, I think that's the best way to support us. Just to get the word out there, to help this project grow. Just been growing very fast over the past year, and it's been really awesome. So for everybody that has been supporting us over the years, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. It's been a really great ride together and journey. So I'll stop rambling, and here is Hamilton Souther.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Hamilton Souther of Blue Morpho. We're really excited to have Hamilton on the show. Hamilton, I think you're one of the first shamans I ever, Westerners come shaman, who I knew your name, which is really cool to finally be able to talk to you.
So it's a pleasure to talk with you. Yeah, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate your guys' time, and it's a pleasure to be on the show.
Great. So I guess let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit about your pre-ayahuasca life?
Yeah, I mean, my pre-ayahuasca life looked like American suburban life growing up. I grew up in Silicon Valley and fairly near San Jose. And then I ended up going to the University of Colorado at Boulder from 96 to 2000, graduated with a degree in anthropology, was really interested in, indigenous cultures and what was going on in just the rest of the world, and also a greater history associated with humanity and what had kind of brought us to, this place of all of us living in the world today. And I would think that, it was really pretty normal in that sense. I was an extreme athlete. I participated in lots of different kinds of extreme sports and really liked the outdoors lifestyle, and ultimately wanted to travel a lot and see other places, had those opportunities during school, et cetera. And, things started to really change for me after I graduated from college.
That's great. What did that change look like? You maybe had a small psychedelic experience and then got interested in ayahuasca generally?
Sort of. I mean, really, I had different kinds of, pretty extreme experiences, not so much psychedelic, but I had some near-death experiences when I was younger, and also some really major accidents and things like that. And, like a lot of people, I had dabbled around with other kinds of, mind-altering experiences and stuff like that, but nothing really focused or specific, et cetera. But the year after I graduated from college, I started to have literally spontaneous awakenings where I would go into altered states of consciousness naturally and total states of sobriety, utilizing trance and authentic movement and other kinds of relaxation techniques. And in those states, I would have really intense visionary experiences. And those experiences were so powerful that they took me on a journey to go and seek answers for the experiences, and also ultimately training, which is what led me to the Amazon and to my first ayahuasca experiences.
When you say spontaneous, do you just mean like it kind of came out of nowhere, or was it in conjunction with like this, you were saying dance and movement?
At first, it came out of nowhere. I mean, first I just opened up to the idea that there was something more to life, that there was something more to this idea of spirit, and that spirit was real. And I called out to it, and, it's hard to explain exactly, but literally called out to this kind of invisible force that all of a sudden I thought could possibly exist, and really gave my life to it. I felt like I was without direction and without purpose at that time in life, and I was looking for something greater, and that was a direction to be able to take. And so I literally gave my life to this idea of spirit. And then after that, I started having visions that included what other people called spirits. That for me at that time, it was very difficult to comprehend the nature of the experiences. But like I said, there was this very direct messaging. And then I turned to shamanism as a means to try to explain the nature of those experiences. And from having studied anthropology, I understood that in shamanism, there was at least a context to describe the nature of the experiences that I was having in visionary kinds of experiences. And so through those teachings and guidances that I found through different books on shamanism that I started to read at that time, I realized that I was going through a very traditional awakening to shamanism, and that it was a direction that I needed to pursue.
Yeah. And this was happening while you were doing your undergrad in anthropology, or did you kind of stumble or have these experiences beforehand?
No, I mean, the experiences were actually in the year after I graduated.
Okay.
It wasn't anything during the time of my study or anything like that. That was just a really normal life, I would say, by, typical American standards.
Yeah. And did you focus on studying shamanism in your anthropology, or?
No, I had a really broad focus. I focused half of my studies between physical anthropology and half of my studies in cultural anthropology. And I was, like I said, really interested in indigenous cultures. I don't know why, just kind of this idea of people that had never been contacted from the Western world, and Amazonian tribal people were fascinating to me. They had such a different view of life and operated based off of such a different mythological context that they were just truly fascinating. It wasn't even something that I could say that I had a real deep handle on at that time. Just, it was, a very young person in their early 20s who was looking for something more to life than whatever it was that I had experienced at that time. I was looking for something, I think, of deeper meaning. And so, at that time, the adventure of going someplace far away, deep into the wilderness where, there might be some people that were authentic and knowledge keepers or wisdom keepers, less affected by the encroachment of Western society, was something that was just really interesting to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's just so interesting, like you brought up the spontaneous experiences, within like the spiritual emergence framework, that's a thing. I don't know how much we've actually talked about like spontaneous, mystical, spiritual experiences on the show. So it's just cool to hear you talk about that and to just highlight that people can have these experiences without substances or doing any sort of technique. Sometimes people have these just spontaneous things like, spirit just kind of comes through you or something, and boom, there's some sort of calling there. So really interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, in my case, it wasn't even sought after. I wasn't specifically looking, I had just come to a place literally that felt dead end. And my mind couldn't figure out a direction to take in the middle of that paradigm that I was looking at that time. And, it wasn't even cathartic. It wasn't specifically purposeful to healing, et cetera. It was just a literal spontaneous awakening to spirit. I just had from one moment, an idea that everything was closed off and separate. And literally in the next series of moments, there was a presence there that was obvious and greater than anything that I had ever connected with before. I knew that it was a kind of fundamental shift in consciousness, although I didn't understand how to relate to it at that time. I just knew that it had occurred. I knew it was something you couldn't come back from. My mind was literally now operating differently. And I felt like it was in direct response to this, inner calling that I had put out there to really connect to something beyond just myself. And once that happened, literally the whole direction of my life changed.
So what year did you graduate from Boulder? Sorry if this
2000.
is an impolite question. Okay, 2000. Cool.
Yeah.
And 2001, you made your way down to Peru?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really great. That's early. Yeah.
Path was now taking me to Peru, and that in Peru, there was the possibility, at least, of finding these people. I had this idea that they existed. I felt like there was this deep calling to them. I felt like I was being guided. It wasn't just taking a trip somewhere and hoping. I felt like I had this very clear guidance associated with me. It was being led by this thing at the time that I called spirit. And ultimately, it was supposed to end in finding this apprenticeship. And in my case, literally within the amount of time that I, heard in my head and that it would take, I had the experiences, and I ended up finding the location, at least, where I would apprentice. I didn't find the shamans yet, but I found the location, and I had my first ayahuasca ceremony there. And in that ceremony, obviously, it was, beyond recognition, the most intense and powerful experience of my life. And in the visions that I had during that ceremony, it was clear that I was supposed to stay in that part of the forest. And ultimately, it turned out that where I was located was about 500 yards from, the really one of the greatest elder shamans and mystics of that entire area, one of the highest regarded healers and men of knowledge of that whole place. And so it wasn't by accident that I ended up on that little river in that part of the forest. And it was just very clear from the visions in that first ceremony that I was supposed to stay there and ultimately learn and study there, although it seemed too fantastical to be true because it was so remote and so far away. It was literally 24 hours overland travel from the city of Iquitos, which was the nearest city you could fly into. The travel was all done by boat. And the location where I was literally beyond the last house on the little river. And so there were no inhabitants for 6 days overland from where I was to the Brazilian-Peruvian border. And just to get the messages and ceremony there, that I was going to stay there and study there and train there and learn, just seemed, like I say, too fantastical to believe. And so I just simply asked, well, what am I supposed to do first? And the first message was learn how to live here, learn how to live in the forest.
It's like a very practical first step. It's interesting.
I think the whole thing was practical. What seemed beyond practical was this idea that there was something, greater, just spirit. I mean, this idea that there was something truly greater than just us, that the mind was a very small bubble, and that outside of the bubble of the mind was a guidance and a power and a force that was literally true and something that could be tapped into. And the more research I did about tribal cultures and, historical cultures really deep in human history, the more I understood that was a very common concept and very common theory and mythology for them. And so it seemed to me that it was just something that had gotten lost over the years in a way of thinking amongst modern humanity, but that guidance or that presence was still there. And in my case, coming from a scientific background, I demanded that the guidance be practical. I didn't want to be on some wild goose chase, even though most of the time I thought I was, but I didn't want to be on one. I didn't want to end up, having everything fall apart and have it turn out not to be true. And so I demanded, literally step by step through this process of awakening, that the guidance that I received be grounded in reason and logic, and something that could have real proof and could present itself in a way that you could say, okay, that really is the culmination of, these series of visions. And in my case, it turned out the way that the visions were forming.
Right. This is really interesting, because I think there are a lot of people kind of having these, quote unquote, awakening experiences, and they might have like a vision to go somewhere. They're being called to go do something. And so I guess what was your process like in that? Like, how did you trust that? How did you use some discernment there of being like, am I making this up right now, or do I really need to follow this? And I guess, you were talking about a little bit practical and asking for some grounding there, but, is there anything else there that any advice of how to even listen to that, or how to use some discernment in situations like this?
Well, I think you have to, especially if you're utilizing different kinds of visionary medicines. It's really easy to fall into the trap of self-delusion. And it's really hard to discern between what is a clear message and a clear direction and what is something that's being self-created. And so I think that the easiest discernment is to, take the experience at face value, but demand literally that there be proof for the nature of the experience. And that proof can be granted by many different kinds of circumstances. If it's to go somewhere and be received, you have to be received. If it's to, connect with somebody or connect in another form or way, the connection has to happen. You can ask another person that's part of it, et cetera. You can use checks and balances. And I think in my early period of time, I used doubt. I doubted the experience more than just accepting it as is. I would have the experience, not doubt in a negative critical way, but just doubt it in the sense of not being willing to believe it until some greater proof had been given to the experience. And so I didn't think doubt was something that was negative to the experience, but rather something that helped support a grounded, rational take on what I was experiencing and what I was trying to navigate. And so instead of being willing to just believe out of the experience, I said, okay, I had the experience, but it could mean anything. It could mean, something absolutely true, or it could have been just made up by the mind. It could have been clear guidance. It could have been something that is taking me off my path, et cetera. And so I would ask for different kinds of confirmation. And I think that that's something that anybody could take away from that, to be able to continuously ask the question and also expect confirmation. And if you really are tapped into this guidance and you're really tapped into this greater support that I think many people who participate in sacred plant ceremonies experience, then they can utilize that idea of question and check and balance as a way to be able to help navigate the truth of their experience.
It's really great. It's it's a hard skill to teach around discernment, but I think it comes in time. So thank you for sharing that too. It's helpful. Now, when did you first realize that you wanted to facilitate or be a shaman? Was it mid-apprenticeship or how did that work for you?
Well, the idea of being a shaman came actually really early on, although I don't think I understood at all what it meant. So it was just kind of like a concept. It was these people called shamans do these practices and have these capacities and ultimately provide support and healing to people. But it was really like an unknown vast knowledge base that was encapsulated in the concept shaman or shamanism. And without there being like a school of shamanism or, a kind of like shamanism 101 in the indigenous world, first you had to be accepted by shamans. And so is literally an anthropologist's dream, to go somewhere and, start to study the location and the environment that they're in, and then ultimately get accepted by the tribe or get accepted by the people enough to be brought in and to be allowed to have the experiences themselves. And so I think for the real early part of my journey, there was this desire to fulfill that anthropological understanding. And the idea of facilitation of actual experiences for people after having my first experiences with ayahuasca seemed completely fanciful and really ridiculous, because it was just so powerful and so overwhelmingly intense that I couldn't actually visualize or even imagine how I could go from being the vomiting, defecating, spinning, visionary guy was on the ground. It was so bad. It was literally so bad compared to the composure of the shamans. I would look at them and think like, this is impossible. How do you ever like gain the constitution to be able to facilitate this kind of experience? And so early on, it was really not about me being that thing or doing that practice, but it was about learning and being invited into this sort of secret realm of knowledge that these mystics in the forest had, and that they talked about amongst themselves, regularly and very openly, as if they were having a very rational conversation. And most of the stuff that they talked about, I couldn't rationalize. I couldn't understand. Even though I spoke the language, I wasn't capable of really understanding the ideas that they were sharing. And it was the first time I realized that some people really have different minds. Like we don't all just share the same mind, and that in some context, the mind is a logical, rational mind, but so different in the way that it processes information and understands consciousness and reality that it literally at that time seemed like a different world to me. And so at first, in the first years were really about learning how to survive in the forest, live in the forest, survive in the sense of food, to be able to subsist out of the forest like the locals, and really be trained just to live there. And I considered that really the first biggest gift of all, because in a way it was like being reborn. It was like being given an opportunity to go back into early childhood and relive the totality of early childhood, even though I was a young adult, because I literally didn't know how you walk through the forest, and you walk differently than you walk down a street. It's uneven, and there's roots everywhere, and it's slippery, and there's vines, and there's, all sorts of different kinds of spiky plants and things that could ultimately be dangerous, et cetera. And the vegetation is so dense in the Amazon in different parts where you can be that, you have to walk with a machete, and you have to literally clear a path to be able to get through it, et cetera. Or you're on a river in a dugout canoe, and they're made by hand. And so they're not, completely uniform in the shape and architecture of them. And you have to really learn how to balance, et cetera. And so there was so much learning to do just to get around and navigate, and to live off grid, and to build my own house, et cetera. I mean, the first house I ever lived in out of college I built myself with the help of locals. And so, to go through those kinds of experiences, I thought at that period of time in my life, at the age of 22, 23 years old, was just fantastic to be having those experiences at all. It was so adventurous and so far from what I had grown up in and experienced going through college. And then through the years of practicing and going through formal apprenticeship, that really is a transformational process. And it takes you from being a true neophyte in the shamanic arts and in the indigenous knowledge base, and truly little by little, it transforms you to being able to sustain what is required to be able to hold the ayahuasca ceremonies. And in my case, after a year or two of drinking in ceremonies and participating, I started to get the hang of it and started to feel like that was something that I could really do. And towards the end of my formal apprenticeship was when it went from being something that looked impossible to actually being something that looked incredibly fun and something that you would want to dedicate your life to. Something that was really worth a kind of a true dedication and pursuit that was unending and continuously teaching. And it looked to me like something that, like many mystics talked about, a lifelong path of learning, that's what that would be. And I was sitting with, a gentleman named Julio Llerena Pinedo, who at that time was in his late 80s, and his prize student and best friend, who was Alberto Torres Davila, who works with us still to the day and is one of my best friends. He was in his 40s at that time. Now he's in his 60s. I was in my 20s. Now I'm in my 40s. Sitting with them, sort of in my 20s, Alberto in his 40s, Julio in his 80s, and going through these transformational practices really showed me that it was something that was lifelong. And it seemed at that time like that would be something incredible to learn and dedicate myself to, especially after seeing this incredible power that the ceremonies held for the locals. At that time, we worked with very few Westerners, and most of the work that we did truly was in their local and indigenous healing practices. And I thought it was also, not only fascinating to experience and be in the presence of them as they did their healing work, but ultimately to get to work with indigenous people and to actually help them and heal their children and heal their elderly was, to me, such a gift that it bonded me to that experience and to that place, and made it become something that made me think that if we could facilitate it for others, that would be a tremendous thing to do.
Wanted to back up a minute when you talked about the language and cognition being so different. Could you give an example of one of the things or types of things you encountered with your teachers in the community there that are a little confounding?
Sure. I mean, first of all, in the indigenous communities, everybody sees spirits, not just the shamans, literally everybody. And they believe that the forest is completely alive with spirit, and that spirit really comes out at night. And so just first of all, to be around a group of people that spoke so openly about the concept, and where everybody, including children, would be able to identify and see with their eyes open, not in psychedelic experiences, just in their normal daily life. The idea of the presence of spirit and entities was so foreign to me that it was fascinating. And, that was literally daily occurrence. And then in talking with Alberto and Julio, I realized at first that after a while that they didn't differentiate between waking states of consciousness, dream states of consciousness, and ceremonial states of consciousness. So in our normal language, if you're talking with friends and they're telling you about a dream they had a night before, they preface it with, "I was in a dream the night before." And these guys didn't speak that way. They just spoke in a continuous flow of experience without these time and contextual separative barriers between their notion and flow of personal experience. So a conversation could be about something that was happening in ceremony in a visionary state, and that was just as real to the physical world to them as talking about going down the river in a canoe, or going out fishing, etc. And so they didn't differentiate in their language between the visionary experience and daily life experience. And that was, fascinating and also difficult to understand depending on what it was that they were, speaking about in the context of their stories. Because in one story, it could be, well, I went out in a canoe and all of a sudden was swallowed by the mouth of a huge anaconda. And you think like, wait, what? What are you talking about? Like, what do you mean you got swallowed by an anaconda? And then in the next conversation, it's I was in a canoe and I went out fishing and I caught 10 fish and I came back and made breakfast. And then in the next conversation, it was I was in a canoe and this giant, like mythical animal grazed the bottom of the canoe. And in my mind, I'm trying to understand, like, wait, was the anaconda real or not? Like, what's this thing in the water? When were you fishing? Like, what is going on here? And they weren't irrational. It was just literally how they framed information. And then they would intermix it with these, like, these comments that would be very mind pickling, really, like when we would say goodbye to each other. And this is deep in the forest where there is no electricity, there are no phones, there is only a footpath and a river. There's maybe 50 inhabitants in days worth of forest in this whole area. And they would say things like, call me if you need me. And I'd say, wait a second, I've heard that at home. Your mother says, hey, call me if you need me. Like, what are they talking about? And they were literally talking about telepathic communication. Huh. And they were talking about being able to get each other's attention no matter where they were. And it didn't even mean just to Earth. It meant literally in space-time. And that they just didn't have these barriers and boundaries that are so defining to the nature of how Westerners conceive of the mind and of reality and of consciousness itself. And so the call me if you need me ultimately got tested a number of times. And sure enough, they really do answer when you call. I couldn't believe it. So they thought I would, whenever I doubted them about anything, they would teach me by messing with me, by making it, clear that thing was really happening. And so I remember one time I was in southern Peru in a city called Arequipa, and I was at a pizzeria. So this is, 2.5, 3 hour airline flight away from where these guys live. And they were in ceremony and they called me, and in their ceremony, they literally called to me, and I was sitting there having dinner, and I had to actually excuse myself from the table because I started to go into ayahuasca visions from the table where I was sitting over a pizza, and I had to go outside and steady myself, and I rested up against a lamppost literally on the street having these visions, and Julio and Alberto appeared in the visions, and they said, hey, we just wanted to call and say hi. So I wrote down the day and time just to make sure, right? This is what I mean by doubt the experience, right? I wrote down the day and time, and I went back to them, when I was done with that travel. And when I came back to them, I said, hey, when did you call me? And they told me the exact day and time that it had happened. And they told me that I was in a pizza restaurant and that I was in a city called Arequipa that both of them had never been to. And they gave me literally like GPS stats for me.
Wow.
And things like that, just that they would express in normal conversation, and realized that, they had a very different understanding of the forest and space-time, and that they had really tapped into another kind of knowledge and another kind of wisdom, and that was really what I was looking for when I came down to the Amazon in the first place.
Really fascinating. Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of stories about that. What do you think's going on there? Like, have you I'm guessing you probably thought about this for a really long time. Like, how have you wrapped your mind around this, or what do you think's going on there?
I think that the mysteries of consciousness are still really unexplored and not, understood by science at all. I think that consciousness is a frontier that someday, hopefully, we'll have the time and the opportunity as a collective species to really study and understand. But that consciousness and the mind are two different things. Consciousness is allowing for the mind. And the mind for Westerners really represents what they know of as reality itself. And it's just a very small expression of consciousness. And what the shamans have been tapping into in indigenous cultures forever is literally a way out of the mind. And indigenous cultural people have mind. It's not that they're ignorant of the mind. They just have a different mind. It's not as educated in the school sense. It's more educated by nature and the life itself and the necessities of living off of the land and being part of it. In many ways, it's simpler. In many ways, it's stronger to the adverse difficulties that life can present. In many ways, it's more trusting. The people that I met in the Amazon didn't have words in their language for stress, depression, anxiety. They didn't understand when the first people were coming to us with those quote unquote mental illnesses. And I would try to explain to them what the person was crying over. And they would just be like, but is the person having a bad day? Like, why are they like that? And it was literally a perplexion. So I realized that there was this different nature of mind and that the mind bubble was really small and confined. And that when we would participate in these sacred plant ceremonies, ayahuasca being the main one, but there also being other ceremonies that are also visionary and other kinds of plants that they use. The goal was to break free from that encapsulation of the bubble of the mind and go into this, shared but unexplored consciousness. And in it were the other shamans in the world. You could see shamans from all over the world that were in this consciousness space that wasn't just the mind, and that it really is a kind of interconnected field. And over the years, it made me think of Earth in a completely different kind of way. And it made me see that in the material of Earth itself, with us being humans, being material beings, we literally were interconnected. And our mind was really exceptional at creating separation-oriented categories for everything. But that no matter how much you used the mind to try to create those expressions of separation, that ultimately we were still all interconnected by the earth itself. And so I think that the shamans, without a definition of separation to begin with, were always tapping into that nature of the interconnectedness of just earth as this material energy, and having a way to ultimately tap into something that is, I think, part of our understanding of physics, but not the totality of it yet. And I think it's still why we explore on the macrocosmic and microcosmic at the same time. And I think that ultimately the bubble of that mind, while so powerful for the Western world, is really just a very tiny understanding of the totality of life, and that these other people were just tapping into that same source in another way and able to assimilate consciousness out of it with other kinds of skills. And I looked at them literally like skills. And then I would think back to, the skills that Westerners had developed, which was to use physics in an entirely different way and to be able to create phones and cell phones and be able to harness electricity and modern technologies and industrialization. And I just saw that out of all of that, that was another way of thinking and another way of mind, and ultimately, another series of systems that allowed people other kinds of experiences, and that ultimately all of it was miraculous and exploration of technology and human capacity.
Have you done any exploring or thinking about where those two meet? Like if Western civilizations and whatnot start to adapt this, where's the integration here, or what could happen if we were able to utilize both?
I think that the first thing that would happen is that the nature of the context of the world would change. Right now, I think that there's a real question about the future of humanity. And I think that question would be easier to answer if people felt like they were more interconnected with everybody instead of separate. So the shamans approach life from an understanding of this interconnectedness, not this massive and terrifying separation. And I think that our technologies, while they connect us in different ways of information, it doesn't make it feel like we're connected to each other. And the more we feel separate from each other, the more we're isolated in our own bubble of ego and our own way of thinking, and only being accepting of a very limited number of variables. And, I think when people ultimately come together in another kind of way, and I think in Western cultures, they do it in more brief moments. They do it around, specific kind of holidays, and they do it around different kinds of musical events, etc. Sometimes political movements rally people to a kind of interconnectedness, and sadly, in the face of great tragedy and disaster, typically come together. Beyond that, people typically live in a really encapsulated bubble, and that becomes, like I say, very mind dominant and very egoically dominant. And I think beyond that is a much greater understanding of the interconnectedness of life, and how we're not separated by space-time, but rather connected by space-time. It's an actual inversion of the concept. And that if you're made of the material physics, you're part of the material physics. You're part of the earth itself, not just an isolated ego or soul that's here for a period of time, but literally an active and important part of earth itself. And I think that that's hard to frame in our imagination when we come from a concept of such isolation. And if we could bridge the nature of that isolation, I think we would have a much greater and a much more holistic understanding of what's taking place within the earth right now, and kind of collectively and totally. And I think we as a collective species are facing probably the most important time in human history. It's a time where we are having a scientifically proven impact on the totality of the environment, and that it's not just happening in isolated regions, but is literally happening globally everywhere humans live in large populations. And that's literally now almost every inhabitable place we can as a species. And so in that true nature of globalization, I think we would have a great shift in mentality, a great shift in consciousness, and a great shift in what we consider to be the most important aspects of life if we could tap in to this idea of greater connectedness.
We talk about environmental stuff a bit on the show. Obviously, we kind of have to these days, but the idea I always came up with for chatting about how could psychedelics and sacred plants help with the environmental crisis. What you just laid out is what I typically don't say, but it is pretty important. And we have actual data these days to say our affinity towards environmental causes is increased post psychedelic use. But that does need to be paired with creativity though, and problem solving around this. But I guess the first thing is understanding that we have a situation and we're part of it. We can play an active healing role. And we're far more powerful than we think. I guess that's a pretty affirming way to say it. But we have to find that power, I guess.
And I think collectively harness it. The Amazon, when you're in the Amazon and you're living in the forest and you're participating in these visionary experiences, you see the interconnectedness of life. And the shamans truly believe that they learn directly from the plants, and that there is a way to communicate. And when you feel that way about the earth and you feel that way about life, it's such a different paradigm to come to when you look at different kinds of environmental questions and causes. And if the earth can teach us, and we have learned all these different ways to create what we're calling the problems in the first place, then I think it is literally our inventiveness and ingenuity that ultimately creates the solutions. To me, the question is just when we collectively all agree that it's worth it. I think globally, we've all agreed that education is worth it. Globally, we've agreed that literacy is worth it. Globally, we've agreed that in different forms of participating in the economy is worth it. So I think there comes a time where we collectively also agree that with this incredible ingenuity and inventiveness, it's worth it to really address on a massive scale what we're facing collectively. And I think that that's part of our natural evolution.
And do you see plant medicines or psychedelics part of this, or do you feel like there might be other ways of getting at this?
I think they're already part of it.
Right.
You know, I don't think that there's any notion of separation associated with this. I think the forest is conscious and alive and knowledgeable. And I think part of the great growth in people's interests in visionary experiences and connecting with these kinds of plants, and there's lots of different kinds of plants, you know, from all different regions where plants grow. There's plants from the Amazon, there's different kinds of fungus and mushrooms, there's different kinds of cannabis, there's plants from the desert that are cactus, there are animals that naturally produce these different kinds of substances and create these visionary experiences. And when you see this really broad range of interconnectedness of, you know, what the shamans around the world have called teacher plants and teacher spirits or teacher beings, that they're already involved. I think people for now decades have been having experiences from the Western world and being awakened in different kinds of ways to understanding the importance of these kinds of concepts that we're talking about, whether it's about the environment or certain social concerns that are happening, and being affected in the nature of their own creativity and being positively affected in their creativity by these experiences. And I think that the plants have a very specific role to play and literally do care. I think that's a common concept that comes out of the ayahuasca ceremonies, that the plants have a very caring, very loving nature associated with them, especially when they're interacting and working with people, and that the ultimate teachings that come from them are peace-oriented and resolution-oriented, and also incredibly opening of creativity and problem-solving to address what are the greatest concerns that the people who come to the plants have within themselves. And I think as the environment becomes more of a topic of concern and also what is presented as more of a crisis, more people coming to the plants have those concerns and questions. I know at Blue Morpho, it's always now a topic of conversation, and that even if we steer the conversation away from it, the guests bring back the topic of conversation. And so it's becoming part of the literally the global conversation. And as that happens, the plants that are already involved and already part of human consciousness and already supportive, I think have a role, and they're executing that role. They're expressing that role. And the people that are open to listening are already hearing the message and starting to do different things about it. And I think that there's going to be, you know, an increase both in demand and desire for these kinds of experiences. And as we're seeing around the world, changes in laws and legislation through really concerted acts by people who have really taken the time to work within the law to be able to have a more open understanding of the healing capacities of these plants and the positive benefits that these plants can offer people. And I see like literally millions of people globally really working on a day in, day out basis to support the nature of the growth of the planet and the growth of life and that life affirmation. And I see that the psychedelic plants have a huge role to play in that. How it ultimately plays out because of global legislation, et cetera, I think is still to be determined. But ultimately, the positive expressions are becoming part of popular culture and part of popular knowledge. And as that happens, that really does become an impetus for not only individual growth, but also for collective change. And the nature of that change seems, at least for now, to be going in a positive direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe let's take a little turn away from this and talk a little bit about Blue Morpho and what you guys, what you and your team do there, that might stand out from other offerings.
Well, Blue Morpho, you know, is a center that we created as a collective group. The shamans that I worked with and I, you know, talked about offering these kinds of ceremonies to people that would come from all over the world. And we did ceremonies to check it all out with the plants. And if they were also in agreement to, you know, helping literally people from everywhere. And what we got was, you know, resoundingly positive responses from the plants and from the experience in ceremony, and the shamans were open to working with what they considered to be foreigners. And so we started Blue Morpho in 2002, 2003, and then really evolved over the years to focusing on offering ayahuasca ceremonies, traditional Amazonian tree dietas, Sanango dietas, and now we're opening up to offering San Pedro ceremonies as well. We've done a lot of San Pedro work outside of the center in the Amazon, but now we're going to bring San Pedro into the center for the first time this year, which is a huge development for us. And we focus on group-based retreats where people come and they sign up for a spot on our retreat. The retreat is usually typically somewhere between 28 and 32 people that come, and we go through a series of ceremonies together. People come from all over the world. We've had people from over 100 countries visit us and from all over the United States. And, I would say beautifully, really, the majority of the people are really coming for the right reasons, with really clear intention for transformation, growth, exploration, and personal healing. And, we're featured in a number of international publications over the years from people that wrote articles about the transformational experiences that they had with us. And that really grew us as a center. And over 17 years, we've worked to literally better what we could offer, the nature of the guests coming to us. And I think where we stand out as a center is the level of professionalism and care that we give to each group and to each person. Because we've had now such a long time to be able to go through all the pain points and learning about how to really run a lodge and be able to run a professional organization, the people that come to us know that they're really coming to something that has taken into account every variable necessary for them to have a safe and comfortable physical place to be, that's also geared and dedicated around these sacred plant ceremonies. So that literally every aspect of our operation is increasing the possibility of having a very positive experience, a very transformational experience, and also the absolute best outcome that you could expect from these kinds of ceremonies.
Thank you for that. You mentioned the various dietas, and it's a funny conversation, right? Like I think in the West, a lot of people say I went and hung out with and did some ayahuasca, and the disease X was resolved. But often there's a correlation to a different plant medicine or series of plant medicines or dietas that was probably more the cause than ayahuasca. And there's all sorts of dietas that you could go on, right? Like just various tree plants that aren't really psychoactive, but it's part of the tradition to, I guess, I don't know, download or communicate with those. Do you have a way of speaking about dietas that might be helpful?
Sure. Yeah, I think the idea, first of all, that Amazonian plant medicine is focused around ayahuasca is a misnomer. I think that ayahuasca is an aspect of Amazonian plant medicine. And there are literally hundreds and even thousands of medicinal plants. And shamans who really know their medicinal plants know hundreds of them and know how to use them in a variety of different kinds of ways. And the shamans go by different titles typically associated with the medicinal plants that they specialize in. So ayahuasca shamans are ayahuasqueros, tree shamans are paleros, Sanango shamans are sanangueros, etc. And the way that they learn is through this process that they call dieta. And it translates directly to diet, but it's something very different than a weight loss diet like you think of in the West. It's actually a period of time where you go into a deep kind of individual isolation and connection to a specific kind of medicinal plant, where you create a relationship with that plant by ingesting an aspect of the plant. In the tree shamanism and the tree dietas that are used for healing all sorts of physical ailments and also, spiritual, psychological ailments, the shaman typically uses barks from them. In other kinds of dieta, you use roots. etc. But in the tree dietas, in the palo dietas, you take barks of different kinds of medicinal trees. And in the mythology of the shamanism, it's said that the trees themselves have these doctor spirits or curative spirits that are connected to the tree. And you make a tea out of them. They're not psychoactive in a traditional sense. The shaman sings icaros to the tea itself. The tea typically is not even boiled. It's just literally bark and water and let to sit for a number of hours. And then icaros are sung in the name of the person who's going to go into the dieta. And then the person drinks the tea. By doing so, it is said that the spirit of the tree is transferred to the person, and that a bond and relationship to that tree and that what we think of as tree species or kind of tree has been established. And then you go into a period of great restrictions. Your food is limited. Your activities are limited. You have to be in a period of sexual abstinence. You do not consume any kind of Western medications, any other kinds of drugs, no alcohol. You rest most of the time. If it's truly in a traditional space, you're not even in like a lodge or a bungalow. You're literally at the base of the tree in a little lean-to or tambo, that you make yourself, etc. And you go into a deep state of meditation and connection to the tree and really ask the tree for help and for the healing that you're looking for. And through that process of going and completing the dieta, which could last, depending on the tradition, from a week to 2 weeks to a month to a series of months or even up to a year. You go through this transformative experience by having, like I said, these very strict restrictions, and then being in this meditative communicative state that is being facilitated by the tree and the shaman, so that this transference of this energy can come to you and, in theory, transform your illness, literally heal you or cure you of the illness itself.
Interesting. And these can be certain times, could be like a few days to a week or plus.
Yeah, they last different amounts of time. Some are shorter, some are longer, and it depends on the tradition. In our tradition, we would do dietas that were either 6 days, 9 days, or 15 days. And we would do them with one plant or a mixture of plants. And it would always depend on the individual reason and the purpose and the training or the patient that you were working with and what illness or what transformation they were looking for. It's also, I think, key to note that dieta is a massive part of the training process of the shamans, and that they are required to do dieta often in the training process to be able to gain the relationship with the plants, to be able to become powerful or capable practitioners of the Amazonian plant medicine.
Yeah. How about let's dig into the training aspect. I know we chatted a little bit about it before hitting record, and I think there's a lot of people that are interested in pursuing a path like this, or they might see training opportunities. So yeah, what's some of your advice or tips or just general advice on how to go about doing any sort of shamanic training?
Sure. I mean, I think that training is, first of all, the biggest commitment you could possibly ever make, because you're making it between you, a whole bunch of plants, a tradition that really matters and is going to change, the course of your life. And so I think, first of all, training really comes to the people that feel that deepest calling, that really want to participate in this, something that is truly lifelong for them, and that they're willing to make that commitment. And then if you are, really serious about training in the Amazonian traditional sense, you find a lineage of shamans that are willing to accept you, and that is a journey, and it's considered a test. If you're not just born to a lineage of shamans that you ultimately get grandfathered into, you have to be accepted as an outsider, which is not an easy task. And so there are some traditions that are now more open to accepting people from outside of their actual blood lineages or their tribal lineages, and some are still very, very closed off from that. And so you need to find a group of people that are open to training people from outside of their lineage, and then, you go through a series of tests. It's a very hard process. It's the equivalent of going through any kind of specialized training in the Western world. And it can take anywhere from a number of years to decades to ultimately complete. And it's considered a journey. And it's considered a tremendously adventurous journey that you're embarking on. Even if you're living in the same location and you're not going far away from your house, it's still considered a journey. And that the journey is part internal, it's mental, it's also part of participating in the visionary plant ceremonies, and it's meant to be a test. It's meant to be incredibly difficult. It's meant to push you in all the different ways that you could be pushed psychologically, mentally, emotionally, and physically, to be able to really be a wisdom keeper and a medicine keeper of that tribal lineage. And to be able to be a person who has the capacity in a very real and very grounded way to be able to support the members of that lineage or that tribe or that community group with their different kinds of spiritual and medical needs. And I think that there's been a change a little bit with Westerners' interest in ayahuasca and the traditional practices, because there's such a focus on ayahuasca and facilitating those kinds of ceremonies. But the real practices extend way beyond that of ayahuasca ceremonies and go into also, how you treat lots of different kinds of ailments that now would be, sent to the hospital. Different kinds of dermatological conditions, fevers, intestinal illnesses, flu, cold, the common cold, those kinds of things, as well as joint injuries, bone injuries, and then the different kinds of ailments that the elderly start to experience typically in the indigenous jungle life, which often has to do with arthritis and pain and the way you treat those other kinds of illnesses with medicinal plants. With specifically ayahuasca, I think the training is obviously a little bit different because it's really about facilitating the nature of the ceremonies, and it's not so focused on the nature of physical illnesses. But regardless, the intensity of the training is the same. You're going to be establishing this very real, very concrete, and very profound relationship with the plants that you work with. And you're going to do so through hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of ceremonies and meditative experiences with those plants. And in the Amazon, it's said that you have to be given this gift or this original ability to be able to connect and have that deep, profound connection with the plants in the first place. They call it a don, that you have to have this don, and that's what becomes the origination of your calling. And then with that gift that you have that already establishes that connection and that dedication then grows over time. And I think it's important to note that in the traditional Amazon, your training and then tests of that training would last anywhere from 10 to 15 years, typically. And that's a very, very long and very arduous experience that you have to really feel called to, and something that you absolutely want to dedicate yourself to be able to have a positive outcome associated with it. The ideas in training are to ultimately weed out the people that for whatever reason don't have all the characteristics and qualities necessary to ultimately become that practicing shaman for the tribe. And we come in the West from a kind of education where it's about graduating and about lots of people graduating and, learning as much of the practice as you can, but ultimately, graduating with whatever kind of grades. In shamanism, there are no grades. It's literally all pass-fail. But it's not pass-fail at a C level like in school in the West. It's pass-fail at like the highest level of what you would think of as A. You literally have to pass all of the tests that give you the capacity to be a really profound practitioner if you're part of a serious lineage. And I mean, in the case of our lineage, it was very serious and it was very strict. And the process of learning was, incredibly difficult and has proven so over the years. People have tried to learn and it has been very difficult for them. In my case, I think I was well suited to learning, but it didn't change the fact of how hard it was. It was literally at times life-threatening. And I think something that you need to take very, very seriously if you feel that calling.
Yeah, and in some like traditions, I know they say it is a calling and it's not just for everybody. And I always like the work of Martin Prachtel, and I remember in one of his books, he said, this is a terrible job. Who would want to be a shaman? Like, maybe part of the village hates you because you think you're associated with like the black magic, or somebody got sick, they're putting blame on you, or, then you go through all these trials and tribulations of getting sick or coming close to death, or like your family members die off. There's just all these trials and tribulations associated with it. And I've always kind of appreciated kind of his take on it, that, it is this calling, and it's not for everybody. And I think right now it's starting to become, I don't know, I guess a little bit trendy in a sense, or people are becoming more interested in it. People might want to like maybe think it's a calling, but maybe it's actually not. And, maybe they do start training and testing and realize, oh, wait, this isn't for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, when I trained with Alberto and Julio, they told me that 1 in 100 make it. That's a really low percentage, right? It's like just an unbelievably low percentage of success if you think about that kind of training process. And somewhere along the way, this idea has changed from, out of 1 in 100 who get the calling that actually make it, to lots and lots and lots of people are going to be these, shamans. And I really deeply question the validity of that. I question, in the westernization of shamanism, where you separate from the real traditional experiences that create the transformation and turn somebody into the shaman, and then really does have a job that is not really that great of a job or an easy job, compared to an idea of teaching about shamanism and lots of people learning shamanistic techniques, etc., and applying those techniques. I think that's very different to somebody who goes through indigenous training and ultimately becomes that practitioner. I know that there are lots of different kinds of shamanic technique classes and trainings and different ways of gaining certificates and ultimately creating, in essence, a kind of like coaching or supportive career out of the concept. But I think that it's important to note that that's very different to what a traditional shaman is from around the world, and regardless of the culture that they come from. Around the world, a traditional shaman is somebody that has experienced this massive calling and awakening, and ultimately has gained the respect of other people that have dedicated themselves to that same kind of calling, and then have now dedicated their lives to learning these kinds of practices and arts that ultimately are beneficial for the greater collective community. And then they spend the rest of their life in service to that community. And it really is a job of service. And it's not an exalted job of service. It's a necessitated job of service. And I think that there are a lot of people who, maybe are disenchanted with other kinds of jobs in the West, or they think that this is another kind of spiritual practitioner, and I would just hedge away from that. And I would warn away from that there's a big difference between learning shamanic techniques and incorporating different aspects of this in your life, compared to fully embracing a shamanic tradition and culture and fully immersing yourself in that culture and going through the trials and tribulations to become a practitioner. If you have that calling for real, absolutely. I had that same calling. It ultimately became a direction that was in many ways beneficial in my life and led to the creation of, most of what we do. But I also at the same time tell people, to become an Amazonian shaman, you first learn how to purge all of this stuff out of you. That's just brutal to go through. And as soon as you're done and you become a shaman, all the same stuff is in your patients, literally 3 feet away from you. Mm-hmm. So how far did you really move it? How far did you really move that stuff out of your life?
Right.
It's not that you got rid of all this stuff and now you live this blissed out, perfect existence. It's that you really learned how to deal with the hardest, nastiest, most difficult, craziest parts of the psyche and what people go through, so that you can truly support them and really be there in a state of unconditional support, compassion, and love for them, to be able to guide them and help them through these massive experiences. and ultimately continuously deal with that stuff, whether they call it darkness or negativity or whatever, truly for the rest of your life. And it's a role of service. And I think that some people, I think become enamored with the idea, and they're not really sure what the truth of it is. And I think in terms of a Western sense, there's a lot of it that's like dealing with the trash. There's a lot of it that's dealing with the gnarliest parts of human existence, not the best parts of human existence. And you have to have the fortitude for that. You have to be able to be in a presence of where people are really suffering and understanding that you're bringing to them something that can hopefully alleviate that suffering. But that when you take on that role of shaman and you really do train, most of the people that come to you are in one state or another of suffering. Mm-hmm. And you have to be able to have the will and the stomach for it, just like if you worked in a hospital, or, just like if you, dealt with, I don't know, just trash on a daily basis, whatever, the most difficult aspects of humanity and being alive. And so there's a part of it that I really think, because of that, really strips away the veneer of the romanticism, and it takes it into something that's truly profound and deep. And in that, if you have that calling and it's still there, then I think obviously not only you, but spirit will manifest the path to make it happen. But otherwise, I would be very cautious about just embarking into shamanism, especially traditional shamanism. It is a serious world filled with very, very, very serious scenarios that you have to confront and face to be able to have a positive outcome.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So we're at a bit over an hour, Hamilton, and we usually wrap around now. I'm curious if there's any other information you might want to share with the listeners before we close up shop.
I think, the most important thing is to stay open-minded, especially in today's day and age. I think I warn against this kind of ever-growing dystopian attitude towards the world. I think that there's still room for positivity and hope, and that we need to be the change makers, and that it's our own focus and work and positivity and greater collective that make that possible. And that there's a lot we can do. We're incredibly powerful, especially when we're united in common goals, and that whether they be shamanic goals or about the individual rights that we have as people, or whether they're about the climate and the planet, et cetera, that I would just hedge away from going down the negative path. The negative path is a path that we all know. We've all been down that road before, and there is still something more mysterious and greater about life itself. And it might be cliche to go to that place alone, but I think that it's still necessary to make sure that beacon of light, that beacon of hope, that greater understanding that there's a purpose to life in the universe is still there, and that these kinds of explorations that we're talking about are a way to tap into it, and still incredibly purposeful to the evolution of not only humanity, but also the planet.
Okay, well, Hamilton Souther of Blue Morpho, thanks a ton for being here. That was a lot of wisdom, and we really appreciate your time sharing with us.
Absolutely. I deeply appreciate it as well. Thank you guys so much. It's an absolute pleasure.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Hamilton Souther. I know Joe and I really enjoyed chatting with him, and we learned a lot about the shamanic journey and what it takes to do shamanic training. So if you want to check out more about Hamilton's work, go check his website out, bluemorphotours.com. And thanks again for listening. Again, if you want to support the show, you could go to psychedelicstoday.com/donate, share a piece of content. Stay tuned for any upcoming Navigating Psychedelics courses. Again, we offer the live cohort, but you can also enroll into our pre-recorded course and kind of take that at your own pace without the live components. And we also have a trip journal and integration workbook up on Amazon. So if you're preparing for a journey or a trip, or you're having kind of difficulty processing your experience, you go to Amazon and just type in psychedelics today, and you can find our printed journals up there, printed workbooks. And if you are having a difficult experience, we do offer coaching calls. So if you want to work together one-on-one, if you have any questions or you've had a difficult experience and you're just looking to help process this or process any emotions that are coming up before an experience, reach out to us. Psychedelics Today, email at Gmail. You can check out our services at psychedelicstoday.com, services, and then integration coaching or consulting. We'd be happy to work with you, chat with you, and help you any way we can. So thanks again, everybody, for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.